You can see here that when we create a user, we are returning everything that is contained in the user record in the database, including the email address and all the timestamps, the ID, and all whatnot. This is totally fine if that is what you want to do, but I prefer to customize what I send out to the front end. And there are several ways you can do this in Laravel. If I go to the register user controller, I can do this by simply selecting what I return here. So return response JSON, and I provide the fields that I want to expose. User ID, for instance, user first name. Let's assume those are the fields I wanted to expose without the timestamps. And you can do this, and that is totally fine. But an easier way to do it, and that is built in Laravel, is to use API resources. And API resources just allows us to control what we expose to the front end to users. So here to generate an API resource, we just do a PHP artisan make resource, and I'm going to call this user resource. And basically, we are going to be creating a resource for every model that we have in the database so that we can use that to control what we are sending out to the front end. So I'm going to create a user resource, and that is created in app http resources directory. We can just use this as is and send it back to the front end, in which case it will still return everything that we are registering the user. It will pull all the records from the database. But I want to change this and return only some of the fields and not everything. So I want to return the ID, which is the ID of the user. So when we actually use this, we are going to pass in a record, which is an instance of the user model. And so we will be able to access the properties of that model class. In this case, I'm taking the ID. I want to get the first name. And I'll just quickly fill this in. And for now, we are only sending through the first three of these. In fact, I want to add another that is a complete name or the full name of the user, which we don't have in the database. Remember, we have the first name and the last name, but we are going to have to generate a full name from that. You can do that by concatenating the first name and the last name to have a full name, but I prefer to do that in the model class itself. So by going to the user model, we can actually write a new accessor that concatenates the first name and the last name, and we return that as name. So to do that, we can just go to the user model and say public function name, and that returns an attribute, which is a cast attribute from within Laravel. It is a type, a data type in Laravel, which is a cast attribute. And if you look here, it's just saying, hey, it's expecting us to return something. Right now, we're returning void. So to return an attribute, we can say new attribute, and we can provide a get function, which is how we want to get the value of the user. It can take a value, which would be the value of whatever we're pulling from the database. So if this was actually first name, then that first name would be passed here. But because we don't have a name as a property or as a field in the user record, this value will not return anything. But we'll leave it there regardless. And what do you want to return? We want to return this first name concatenated with a space, and then this last name. So if you've been using Laravel before, you know that in the past we could do public function get name attribute, and that would basically do the same thing like we just did here and return this. But I just really prefer the new way of doing it because it also allows you to put a setter. So if I had a name column in the database, I can actually do a setter here and use whatever logic I want to set the value of that field. Assuming that I had a name, but I did not take it from the request, and I wanted to generate the name from the first name and last name, I can actually just put this here, and each time a record is created, Laravel would automatically set the name field to a concatenation of first name and last name. But I want this to be calculated on the fly, so I don't need any setter in this case. So right now, because we have created this here, we can directly come to the resource and access it by just saying this name, and that will return a concatenation of first name and last name. So over in our controller, instead of just returning the response with the entire user object, we can actually just do a return user resource make, and we pass in the instance of the user model. Now there are two ways you can do this. You can either just use a user resource make, or you can just say new user resource and pass that through. So these are equivalent. So if I just a new user resource and pass in the user, it's equivalent to this, okay? So you can use either one of these. Now, because we are sending out just a single record, we are basically creating a single instance of the user resource class. If we're sending out a collection of users, then we'll actually do return user resource collection and also pass the list of users. In this case, that's not what we're doing, but we'll be doing that in other situations. So coming back to our console here, I'll just clean the database, PHP artisan, migrate fresh, so that we register that user again. And if we go back to Postman and send that request, we see that we do have the user returned wrapped in a data object, and we have the fields that we specified. Now you can choose to leave the data wrapped in a data object if that is what you want, and you will access all your data through that data object. I prefer my data to just be nested outside of as a parent of this object itself without being wrapped in a data sub object. So to override this behavior for your resources, we can go to the service provider, so the app service provider, and we call a method called without wrapping. So JSON resource without wrapping, and that tells Laravel that for our API resources, we should not wrap the data in a data sub object. We should just return the record as is. So let's go back and clean the database, go to Postman and send that registration again. So if I register, now we see that the data is no longer being wrapped in a sub data object, and it's just a plain JSON that we get back. So you can decide what you want to do, but I prefer to not wrap it here. Unless you're doing pagination, then you have no choice. Laravel will automatically wrap the data for you because it wants to separate the pagination information from your regular record. So going forward, we are going to be using API resources a lot when we are sending data to the front end to allow us control what we actually expose to the client.